Welcome to the Inprint online reading series presented in association with the Inprint Margaret Ruth Brown reading series. I'm Rich Levy, Executive Director of Inprint, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Matt Johnson. Matt is a faculty member of the University of Houston Creative Writing Program and the author of 3 novels, Drop, Hunting in Harlem, and his latest, Pim. Matt is going to read a selection from his new novel, Pim, which simultaneously satirizes and pays tribute to Edgar Allan Poe's novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. Please welcome Matt Johnson.
The main character, Chris James, is researching this lost slave narrative that actually comes out of Edgar Allan Poe's Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. And he goes to meet a distant relative of that author, so that he can find out if the narrative is actually true. I didn't know that meeting Miss Mathis also meant I would be forced to travel from Chicago to the bleak urban landscape of Gary, Indiana. After thoroughly reading her website, I was under the impression that Mahalia Mathis was a resident of the Second City. I soon found that what I thought was a residential address in Chicago was in fact a post office box, and that her driving directions led me not only out of the city, but out of the state of Illinois altogether. This information arrived at my cottage in an overnight package from Mrs. Mathis, along with an elaborate press package that included glossy headshots of the lady and several print clippings from her neighborhood newsletter, some more than a decade old, all attesting to her numerous creative abilities. I found her residence an hour out of O'Hare without much trouble. It was harder to leave my rental car parked on her street, with its thugs hanging about the concrete like bats hang on caves. "Niggers!" Mrs. Mathis yelled at them as she let me into her townhouse, a response which only increased my concern that the car was done for, despite the fact that she insisted this would scare them away for a while. The home of Mahalia Mathis was elegant on the inside, ornate. It was crowded too. There were many possessions on display in this house, and many, many cats to guard those possessions. Mrs. Mathis struck an impressive figure herself, wearing a muumuu of green paisley silk and a sparkled turban to match. She was a statuesque woman, both in height and in weight. Aside from an occasional violent fit of coughing, she didn't look sick or weak to me as she went about her overcrowded house with its many boxes and piles of antiques and random curiosities. She was a hoarder, and I was happy about this. If this woman had ever possessed anything of use to my quest, it was clear that she still had it. It was Miss Mathis's living room, seated at a large mahogany table covered in antique lace, that we began our discussion in earnest, tape recorder and notepad on my side of the table, a dusty box marked Pictures on its lid, and a handwritten scrawl between us. "You must realize that the man you speak of—" "Dirk Peters," I interrupted. I wanted no mistakes about this. "Dirk Peters," she acknowledged, with a hand to the side of her temple, as if even uttering those words made her anxious. "You have to understand, in my family, we weren't even allowed to say his name out loud. No one in my mother's generation talked about him, and that's because no one in her mother's generation did, or the one before that." "But why?" I asked, largely because Mrs. Mathis took a couple seconds off of her opening confession, dabbing her head with a handkerchief repeatedly, even though it must have been barely more than 60 degrees Fahrenheit in the room. I was still wearing my coat. "Because he is the Dirk Peters, written about by that great author, Mr. Edgar Allan Poe, all those years ago. The one who accompanied Arthur Gordon Pym on his southern adventure." She shot back at me as if I was a fool, but I did not feel like a fool in that moment. To the contrary, I felt brilliant. I hadn't even mentioned Poe's novel before this point. "Mrs. Mathis, do you realize that this is a major historic revelation?" I asked, struggling to constrain myself. "It's an important discovery for American literature, and for America herself. Why did your family keep this secret for so long?" In response to my query, Mahalia Mathis made no attempt to hide her disappointment in the poor display of intelligence on my part for even pursuing this line of questioning. After much eye-rolling and elaborate head-wagging had been completed, Mrs. Mathis finally saw fit to compensate for my lack of intuition. "Well, he left that poor white man down there to die, didn't he? Not only did he go along with a mutiny, which would have been brought enough shame to my family's name if it had been widely known. But the fact that he left that poor white man to die on some iceberg, to freeze to death, the fact that Arthur Pym was a famous white man just made it worse. Time was, if white folks hear your king killed one of them, they're liable not to let the fact that it was 100 years ago stop them from getting their rope. Oh, I get it. I see, right. Why didn't I think of this before? Of course, there would have been a larger real-world repercussions to worry about, particularly as an African-American man. And a what? Mrs. Mathis' hand shot down to collapse on my own. An African-American man? I repeated, assuming I garbled the last of my words in the excitement of the moment. When I said African again, Mrs. Mathis squeezed my finger so tight it left me with the impression of being gripped by a blood pressure machine. Honey, I got lots of Indian in me. I got Irish, and I got a little French too. I got some German, or so I'm told. I even got a little Chinese in me on my mother's side. Matter of fact, I'm sure I got more bloods in me than I knows, but I do know this. I ain't got no kind of Africa in these bones, Mahalia Mathis delivered, poking her naps under her turban as she snorted at me derisively. After taking a moment to gather herself from my apparent slight, Mrs. Mathis proved to be as helpful as I hoped. From the cardboard box that sat beside her, she removed a folded piece of yellow paper, carefully wrapped in aged gold cloth, and placed it on the table before me. Although clearly impressed with the white gloves I had brought with me for the purpose to revealing her my own Dirk Peters manuscript, Mrs. Mathis still smacked my hands when I reached for the document. She chose instead to open her fragile paper for me to read. I was expecting to see Mr. Peters' chicken scratch handwriting before me. When I didn't, I could feel my body deflate slightly in response. It was good that it did, because when I read the words there, I needed more room for my mind to expand when I saw the name Edgar Allan Poe written at the bottom. It turned out that Mahalia Mathis was not the only resident of Gary, Indiana to claim Native American descent. Despite the fact that the satellite city of Chicago was 84% black, there was enough Indians to form a club. It was to participate in this gathering that Miss Mathis had recruited me. The Native American Ancestry Collective of Gary, NAACG, met on the first Thursday of every month at the Miller Beach Senior Center. During our long and illuminating ride, I was simultaneously given a tour of the modern-day Gary, complete with a commentary on the most famous entertainment family, and told of the saga of Mahalia Mathis' own family, the Jacksons, no relation. Mahalia's late husband, Charles, had passed a decade before. Charles, Mahalia acknowledged, had indeed been colored. Mrs. Mathis went on to note that both her sons had married white women and that her grandchildren had been spared Charles's burden. It seemed that her sons had been spared more, also their grandmother as well, because it was clear from her tone that she was estranged and isolated from all of her people. Your mother must have been so relieved when you came out, Mahalia Mathis turned in her passenger seat to say to me, reaching out to lightly touch the back of my neck, where my stringy hair met my fired alabaster skin. I giggled nervously, jerked my head, and eventually the older woman put her hand back at her side again. Once the community center had been entered, it was rather easy to locate the dozen or so NAACG members. This was not because the group looked like Native Americans. To my eyes, they looked like any gathering of black American folks. Some tan, most brown. What distinguished this group was their attire. The first man I saw in the room had a full Native American headdress, a stegosaurus spine of white feathers that reached all the way down to his moccasins. He was sitting on the edge of a metal fold-out chair, trying not to harm his plumage while he sipped his coffee from a Dunkin' Donuts cup. As I walked in with Mrs. Mathis on my arm, he turned towards us, and the red war paint he had on his nose and cheeks spread as he smiled. Others in the room were more muted in their attire, but all seemed to have their flair. By the open box of donuts, a woman wore a casual coat made of simulated Hopi cloth. Over by the blackboard, a tall, slender brother chuckled and chatted on his cell phone, his raised hand a miniature museum of turquoise finger ornaments. Past him, a portly man with chemically relaxed hair tied into two greasy ponytails twirled one of those wet ropes with his fingers as he waited for the meeting to begin. The only persons besides myself who were not outfitted in some form of indigenous attire was a brown-skinned woman in a pink raincoat sitting in the furthest chair from the door as she read a magazine, but clearly she was the waiting escort of someone in the group. Somehow it had been spread around the room that I was a reporter sent to cover the event. The folks, pleasant and welcoming, made their introductions by telling me both their names and their native connections: Tanisha Johnson, Cherokee; Anthony Thomas, Chickasaw; Tyrone Jackson, Seminole. "We're so glad you're here, so glad you came to record this special day," Tyrone told me. And the others, who began to take their seats as well, agreed. "Well, you know, I just couldn't let this day go by, could I? This is historic," Mahalia Mathis boomed, her own hair hot combed back into a Pocahontas bun for the occasion. I whispered to her, "I'm sorry, what is today?" "Today, we get proof." That was my surprise. "It will make an excellent essay for you, I know it. Today the truth is revealed, at long last. DNA testing isn't just for criminals trying to get out of jail free. It's for decent Indians trying to prove their heritage." It took us a year and a lot of cell phone calls, but we found Dr. Hollins over at University of Chicago to do our tests for us, part of a program I read about in the Telegraph, bragged Anthony, handling me a cruller on a napkin. "All expenses paid. All we had to do was scrape a Q-tip in our mouths, and they said they would do the rest. I'm going to send my baby to college on this evidence, just you watch. We tried to join the Sioux Nation a few years back, and they had the nerve to turn us down. We'll see about that now," Tanisha humped, the tassels that lined her coat and pants rippling like the legs of a centipede. The others were equally excited as they told their stories of ostracization from their respective native nations. I empathized with their obvious pain. Although they didn't mention it, I imagined walking around Gary, Indiana dressed in Native American attire had probably led to other incidents of alienation as well. It was out of empathy that I removed a pad from my pocket and began taking notes, half convinced that I might just write an essay about this. Maybe I could play at being a pop psychologist. If this Negro in a Rick James jacket could call himself a war chief, then why not? Then the brother from the University of Chicago's lab finally arrived. "Well, as many of you thought, your tests have proven that, as a group, you do have a percentage of Native American heritage. There is a margin of error, of course, but overall, your tests proved to have been between 0 and 32% Native American DNA, between 11 and 64% European DNA, and as for your African DNA, on average then," Tyrone interrupted eagerly, "how much native blood do we have?" The professor stiffened visibly, put down the chart he was reading from, and leaned back on the desk behind him. "Well, on average, you have about 6%. 6% native blood amongst you, which is about the average for African Americans on the East Coast, for instance." 6%? 6%? Tyrone stood indignant. "That's all you could find? 6%? Well, what the hell was the margin of error?" 6%. The professor coughed into his hand and then immediately began shuffling his individual results, moving to hand them out just so he didn't have to stand in the center of the room anymore. As the NAACG members inspected their individual test results, it became clear to me that the natives were getting restless. Anthony, for instance, dropped his Boston cream right into the floor and declared, "It's scalping time!" Mrs. Mathis, clearly trying to keep herself composed, as the elder of this village, not even bothering to look at her own results, attempted to calm the room. "Professor, you did say that some of us have 32% Indian, right? You did say that." "Well, one of you does. The rest, not so much," the professor, in emotion, offered. Amazingly, his coat was already on when he said this, and most of his many papers had been speedily repackaged into his briefcase. "Me!" came a slight but jubilant voice from the far corner of the room. It was a woman in the pink raincoat, who now pumped her fist, staring at her report as if a great bounty had been won. Her round, brown face did look like she belonged to a tribe, but more Igbo than Apache. When I turned back to Mahalia Mathis, she seemed to have aged nearly 10 years in as many seconds. Her mouth was agape. Her top denture clacked loosely down for lack of support. Mrs. Mathis thought the 32% native was her, I realized. That was the only thing that had led her to keep her composure before now. Putting a trembling hand to the folder before her, Mrs. Mathis looked inside, and I peered discreetly over her shoulder. 2% native, 23% European, 75% African. This last bit I saw when I picked the findings off the linoleum after Mahalia Mathis collapsed unconscious.